All right, let's learn some more about Gary Stevenson's of Gary's Economics policy projections. How to save the economy from collapsing. I'm hoping to hear very substantive, very real, possible solutions to these things. Obviously, this is the UK economy. This is what I think he's focusing on, and this is what the majority of, from what I can tell, he is focused on, which is why the objections that I see of he doesn't really he mentions things like tax the rich. That is, from what I've seen in all of his other interviews, which are not on his channel, to be fair, he said tax the rich. That's his catchphrase as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm dead wrong, and certainly enough of the comments have said that nope, you're wrong, that's not what he's saying. Should be tax wealth. Specifically, tax land wealth, property wealth. That is, I think, a reasonable UK solution. You know, it's not necessarily a US solution because, to be honest, there are places in the US where that happens already. So, I'm speaking it from an American perspective. I'm looking at him and I'm looking at this guy thinking, a general wealth tax, if that's what he's proposing, generally speaking, they've never worked before. I don't see any reason why they would work now. However, the idea of a land tax is, I think, fairly reasonable. The other side of this is, he's not the first guy to propose this. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's probably because there are entrenched interests on both sides that Rory Sutherland had mentioned. If everybody in Parliament was getting free property, they're probably not going to want that property to be taxed. So if you're looking at this from a pragmatic standpoint, which again, if you're looking at political change, you should / need to be looking at this from pragmatic, standpoints. What can you actually get done that would further your cause, make people's lives better? If the thing that you propose would absolutely do fantastic stuff for everybody, but it's impossible to get it passed, well, then it's just a waste of everybody's time to even debate it. It's just a complete waste of time. That time could be better spent going, yeah, you know what? We could raise this issue. We could discuss it for weeks, or we could take that week and all of our salaries and all that money, and we could put it into, stopping people getting stabbed on the streets of London and maybe make a dent in that, actually. And that would actually improve people's lives as opposed to dicking around about wealth tax, which is never going to happen.
Really clearly, as much as possible from the ground up, how I think we can stop this economic collapse from happening. All right.
I would also like to hear a little bit of a definition of what he means by economic collapse. I mean, it sounds bad, and I'm sure it is bad, but I do need to know a little bit more specifics about what does this mean? Does this mean like the value of currency is going to collapse? That would cause economic collapse. Yeah. Is it the price of everything goes, through the roof? Is there some, giant, massive transfer of wealth that, would blow out? Again, people's savings would be worthless. People's property would become, insanely, infinitely wealthy. And therefore, there's going to be an underclass of, I think it was 40% of people in the UK don't own property. And therefore, those people are going to be essentially disenfranchised forever. They're going to be just, serfs. They're going to be peasants and will never have any possibility of ever gaining any kind of wealth whatsoever. What do we mean by economic collapse?
For most of history and in most of the world today, pretty much all of the wealth in society, the land, the property, the natural resources, the businesses, are owned by the rich. But
no, that's not true. It's the vast majority of human history, the government has owned most of this stuff because most of the governments were monarchies, and therefore the government was rich. The rich people did not own anything. I understand the impulse to say the rich own everything because obviously, yes, the aristocracy were rich. They were rich because they were part of the government. The aristocracy, the kings, the monarchy, they were all government officials. That's why they owned everything, is because it was part of a state.
But for a period of time after the Second World War, we had a situation where basically all of these groups held a decent amount of wealth. So in my parents' generation, it was normal for even working class families to have a pension and own their own property, for example. So we had a period where all of these groups had a decent amount of wealth. But the rich had more, and especially after their taxes were cut in the 80s, they started to accumulate more and more. And that meant that when other groups in society wanted to access this wealth, wanted to use this wealth, wanted to use housing, property, natural resources, buildings, they had to pay rents, profits, dividends to the rich. And wealth started to flow away from these other groups and towards the rich. And
the government? How is the government paying? I mean, I guess like you could say tax breaks, but I don't know how the government is basically coming on bended knee to rich people. Please, sir, please, can we possibly hunt on your land, sir? I don't see it.
these flows really started to increase, especially during the 2008 crisis and during the COVID crisis. And it led to a situation.
Now, again, the wealth transfer there, I'm happy to say there was a giant wealth transfer from, middle-class people to rich people. That's true. The reason that happened, certainly in my estimation, and I think there's, charts out there to back it up, the reason that happened was because the government shut down smaller businesses. Those smaller businesses then had to shut down. They had to close. They were like, all right, this is our livelihood. What happened? Well, if you basically took away my livelihood for, 6 months, a year, I have to sell that business now. So now the people that were mom and pop shops selling the same stuff that Amazon or, whatever large corporations sold, well, guess what? Now Amazon, now McDonald's, now whatever, has a larger piece of the pie because the government killed all of these small businesses. And so people still had the same demand for these products. So what happened? The large corporations ate up all of that market share. And that's why you have the huge explosion of wealth amongst the richest people after COVID. It was not the rich people in smoky rooms going, ooh, we're going to just steal all of their... No, the government destroyed it and the rich people went, oh, okay, I guess that's ours now. Yeah. They still need their cars. They still need their burgers. They still need their packages. Okay, well, we'll just ramp up production because these people need it. They're asking for us. They're saying, please let us get our stuff. Who are we to turn them away? And it makes us more money? Yeah, obviously. This is a government problem.
Where really there was very large scale transfer of wealth, and that is still ongoing. And the end result was that the working class lost pretty much all their wealth and got into a bit of debt as well. The government is now massively in negative wealth, so they've only got debt. And the middle...
And again, that could just be government mismanagement. They're borrowing money to do this kind of stuff.
Middle class, they kept some of their wealth, but not so much. And the wealth of the rich just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, especially during COVID. What this meant was, because these groups of society who traditionally are the big spenders in terms of proportion of their wealth were losing their wealth, spending fell, wages fell, and because these guys have much more wealth now and these guys have less, these transfer payments which you have to make to use wealth, access resources, went up because you've got less resources now, they've got more, so you need to pay to use a greater amount of resources. So these flows increased, and now we're in a situation where basically these groups are basically wiped out. The working class has basically nothing left. These guys already live in increasingly desperate poverty. The government is like totally bankrupted. They're out. And the middle class has just this little bit left which they're hanging on to, but it's gradually being sucked out, and before long they will be gone too. And then you end up in this situation where basically the rich own everything, you have no middle class, nobody else owns anything, and an economy like that.
Okay, nobody owns anything. What does this remind us of? This reminds me of you will own nothing and you'll be happy. The globalist government world order, this is what that reminds me of. Now, does that mean, were the Davos people, were they trying to influence rich people? Or were they trying to influence governments? I think they were trying to influence governments. And I think it was, this kind of government world order that, basically allows these things to happen. Now, is that the fault of rich people? I mean, like, yeah, okay, were there some, like, horrible rich people that, were trying to uh, screw everybody over and all that kind of, I wouldn't be surprised. Sure, that's totally possible. But a lot of this also has to do with the fact that, the government is there. It's insulating rich people from, the folly and fall of their wealth. Like they're insulated away from this. So like they can get all the good stuff. They can get all these advantages. Any disadvantages or any bad consequences that come their way, the government steps in and goes, no, 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 no. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to you. This is the 2008 financial crisis. These banks get bailed out, and then, it hurts everybody else.
Looks like Nigeria, looks like India, looks like Brazil, and basically you have very broad poverty. If you want to fix this, you need to get wealth flowing back in the other direction. And there are different ways to do this. In theory, you can do it without taxes, and if you are interested in non-tax solutions for getting ordinary families their wealth back, we have a video called The Wealth Time Limit, which I did years ago. But realistically, I think your only realistic hope of getting the wealth back in the working class.
I'm guessing the wealth time limit, just off the title, is probably like once you die, you lose all your stuff. Now, certainly in the US and I think in the UK as well, because I feel like this was a big deal with like the farmers' protests a little while ago. You already get taxed pretty significantly when you die. Now, maybe there's, certain provisions that basically make it so that your sort of static land property wealth tax burden is like insanely low. They don't touch it. But I don't think the farmers would have been protesting if, they would have kept all of their land stuff. They were getting, pretty raked over the coals for that. Certainly in my opinion. Now, maybe, the super rich people wouldn't have gotten as badly hit. And maybe there's some, I'm sure there's like a progressive tax rate where it's like, okay, if you've got $1 billion in property value, the wealth tax on that would have been higher. And then maybe, the government gets some of that because you'd have to sell some of that land. Who are you going to sell it to? That's another issue. Or who are you going to sell it to? If apparently the rich are the only people that have any kind of wealth and could deal with this, well, then it's just a circular argument of, okay, rich person dies. They have to sell off half their assets to pay the tax for it. Well, who are they selling them to? The government can't do it, apparently. So it's just going to another rich person. And therefore, it all stays within this realm of rich people. Each individual rich person gets screwed when they die, and their families get screwed. But the class of rich people stays with, the majority of the wealth. So I don't know if that works.
Back in the middle class, getting wealth to flow away from the rich is, to quote the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, taxes, taxes, taxes. I do really think this is the only way. I know it's difficult because the rich will oppose it, but I think unless we can get much higher levels of tax on the rich, I don't think there is any way we can get that wealth back to working class and middle class families.
All right. So let's think about a tax proposal that could actually work. Well, again, in our last video, Rory Sutherland mentions one that they do in Texas, which is a land tax. So let's say like 2% of the value of your land you pay every year. Okay, that's kind of reasonable, right? That seems totally reasonable. Now, obviously, the value of your land in the UK is slightly different because there's so much less land. The value is extra super insanely concentrated. And then there's also an aspect of, all right, well, what happens if you're, just holding value on that land because you have a huge amount of acreage, but it's just like, it's not doing anything, versus a farm. I've got 1,000 acres of farmland, so this is all working land. I'm doing something with it. Should you be taxed 2%? Well, we already know that these farmers are really struggling already to make ends meet because of, any number of different things. But basically they're hurting. So 2% tax on the value of their land would kill them. They'd be gone, they'd be done. Okay? And again, then you go, all right, well, so then they have to sell off their land. Who are they selling it to? Apparently, the only people that can buy and afford anything are the rich people, so the rich people get more land. So we don't want to do that. It's understandable to then go, all right, let's say we could have 2% land tax on unworked land. Are there any loopholes to that? There definitely would be. But because then, I mean, people do this in the US where they say, all right, well, this is a working farm. This is a working farmland. We're going to, have llamas and that'll be it. That's how we're going to game the system. That would be an easy thing to do. And again, rich people are good at avoiding taxes because they have the resources to do it. So, how do you deal with this? I think you'd have to do something along the lines of like luxury goods taxing, you know? Things that rich people want to buy get taxed at a higher rate. That would be something that would definitely just hit them. It's not going to make a ton of money though, because they would just probably buy less of the luxury goods. The land tax, I mean, like, it makes sense. It does, like, kind of rub me the wrong way as a libertarian, but I understand I understand the desire to basically exact vengeance on people that did better than you through no achievement of their own. I get it. I really do. I don't know if I just really don't know if it's at all pragmatic, which is kind of the main sticking point I have here, is because every proposal he's making or that I can think of historical examples or, just theoretical ways that people could get out of it. And if you've got the incentive to get out of it, you're going to take it.
So, if we're talking about tax, I always think when we are discussing the question of how can we tax the rich more, tax working families less, get wealth flowing back to working class families, I always think it's really, really helpful to break that question of tax down into two completely separate questions. Question one are what specific changes do we want in the tax system? And question two, how do we make those changes happen? And the reason why I think it's really important to separate them is because these are really just two completely separate questions.
They're not. They are intimately connected. And you can phrase them as two different questions, but the process of, making these things happen is what you want to happen. So if you can't answer both of these very well, if one part of this is like, okay, these are all the things that we want to happen. How do we make it happen? And I'm like, well, we've got to take the moon and we've got to, change the gravitational constant of the universe and push it into the sun. And that allows us to enact this policy. Okay, well, we can't do that. Okay, well, these are two different questions. So, we still want the same stuff. We answered that question. So we just now need to figure out how to do it. It's like, okay, you're basically making an impossible question here.
Number one is a question of, really, it's a technical question. It's it's a tax advisor's, it's a tax planner's question. It's a technical economics question. And number two is a question of power. It's a question of how do we force these things. And the reason why I think it's really, really important to separate them is because we tend to focus very, very much on this question one, especially when we are talking to people like me who are economists. We want to say, okay, well, what are the changes in the tax system? What are the changes in the tax system? And I think this is perhaps a little bit naive to the fact that basically at the moment we are losing this debate for question two, which is at the moment we're not getting any taxes at all. We are increasingly seeing changes in the tax system which tax rich people less, which tax working people more. That is true even in countries that have centre-left governments who you might think would be more supportive of poorer people. It's true here in the UK where we have a Labour government. It was true under Joe Biden. We are seeing under governments that are supposed to be left-wing, the inability to raise taxes at all. So I think it's really important to recognize that these two things are...
Okay. Again, we want to be pragmatic here. If that's not going to happen, if you've got left-wing governments that are traditionally, not currently, but traditionally very happy to tax people If they're not doing it and you can't get it done under them, then you need to change your strategy. Taxes are not the answer then.
Separate, because we can often end up in a situation where somebody like me is trying to make a very strong case for the fact that if we don't change the tax system, we will see basically a collapse of society. And somebody who perhaps is rich or is funded by the rich will come in and say, aha, but what specific changes do you want to make? And they will ask you to sort of sit down and carefully plan a brand new tax system right there in front of them, and then they will say, oh well, this specific problem is wrong and this is not going to work. Listen, I am not particularly passionate about the specific form of tax that we take. I'm aware that it is really, really important that this is carefully designed to hit the richest rather than the middle class. I'm totally aware of this problem. And I'm aware that different forms of taxes will have different problems. And I'm aware that we need to be really, really careful about how we plan it, how we design it. But the truth is, the most important thing is that we get a change, and there are a number of forms that change could take. I campaign for wealth taxes. Okay. Some people campaign for equalising capital gains with income tax. Some people talk about closing down the loopholes that very rich families use to pay zero taxes. These are all good plans, but I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The truth...
I understand that. And again, I think that's very reasonable. I will have to say again, it's both of these questions are pragmatic questions. Can it be done? What should it be done? What are the consequences? And all of these are equally important. If a thing absolutely is great and will have fantastic outcomes, but is impossible to pass, get rid of it. It's gone. If the thing is totally passable, we can absolutely make it happen, but it has, no different changes whatsoever because, there's loopholes, because there's tax breaks, because there's blah, 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 then it's useless. Get rid of it. I kind of don't think this approach of redistributing wealth is going to work because I haven't seen it actually happen. I just haven't ever seen any historical examples of this coming off. So I kind of do feel like the only way to move this is, instead of like trying to forcibly redistribute wealth via tax schemes or these types of things, the only thing that probably makes sense is to allow rich people to spend their money stupidly. Have there be a lot more variability, have there be a lot more movement amongst classes. And again, this was a thing, this is why Karl Marx basically said communism and these types of things, it's not going to work in America. This stuff it's not going to work in America. It's not useful in America because there's such enormous movement between classes. Rich people become poor, poor people become rich. It happens very quickly, very often. It happens all the time. And this is probably the way in which you could not necessarily redistribute this wealth, but have there be some way for, working class people to move up, middle class people to stay the same or move up or down, rich people to move up or down, these types of things. That's kind of the only way to do it. Centralizing more power in terms of all right, we're going to take the government, and the government is now going to have extra money to spend. We're going to tax it. We're going to do these types of things. You're then just shifting the power, the resource base and the power base from the rich to government. And government is not really very good with that stuff, because then it's going to try to, it's already trying to do this in a lot of ways. It's already trying to redistribute wealth. You see this in the fact that rich people do pay large amounts of taxes. There's a large dollar amount they are paying out in taxes. This is just a fact. I know it's kind of icky to think that, they're paying huge amounts, dollars in taxes, but they're still rich. Trying to tax them more and get more money out of them is great, except, all right, well, where does that money go? It doesn't go into the pockets of middle class, working class people. It goes into the government. The government then goes, okay, well, how do we want to spend this? And usually they spend it stupidly. They spend it poorly. They just piss it away. It goes into a black hole. it doesn't actually ever reach certainly the pockets of working class people, but usually it doesn't even affect their lives positively through like programs and initiatives. Usually it is just like wasted.
Is we are losing this battle for question 2, and if we lose this battle for question 2, then your family will be bankrupted. So I came into this game, you know, as an economist who thought a lot about question 1, and I kind of became a campaigner, a YouTuber. I literally taught myself how to write a book because I could see we were going to lose question 2. So I am going to focus for the rest of this video on question 2. The only thing I will say about question 1 is I think we need to deal with the fact that some people say there's no point trying to tax the rich because reducing inequality is impossible. And the answer to that is 100% it is possible, because we did it in the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, inequality in this country, across Europe, across the United States, was extremely high, and ordinary families like yours and mine lived in desperate poverty. And over the course of the 20th century, we reduced wealth inequality really significantly. That got wealth into the hands of ordinary families, and it led to a really significant increases in living standards.
This, again, there's a reason for this. Like he mentioned earlier, World War II. After World War II, a lot of people had property. A lot of people had wealth. A lot of people had that. Why did that happen? It's because a lot of wealth opened up because a lot of people died. There was more land to go around because there were fewer people. The people that owned that house, they died. They were all killed. They were blown up. They were, you know, all that stuff happened. That's why there was an increase in wealth. And then, of course, also there's the fact that it's like, you know, you were on the victorious side. And generally speaking, the victorious side does claim wealth from the losing side. That's generally speaking what happens. So it's not a one-to-one solution. You can't look at it and say, hey, look, this did happen back in the day. We reduced wealth inequality. Yeah, kind of, but it was the result of, you know, a lot of people dying. If you wanted to reduce inequality right now, you could absolutely do it by just, you know, blowing up half the country. Like half of everybody in the UK and the US is just executed at random, Thanos style. Bam, you're snapped out of existence. Well, wow, you've just doubled the wealth of everyone involved. Not to mention you've doubled the wealth, but, you know, just randomly you hit, you know, half of the richest people on the planet, and therefore all of their wealth can now be, you know, acquired much more cheaply by all of these other people, because, you know, there's so much more of it available. Everyone's wealth has doubled because they've got more resources. They've got, you know, the supply is the same. The demand is halved. You know, they're all doing better now. Obviously, no one is, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but people are generally speaking not going to advocate for a position like that. And pointing it out is inconvenient to anyone who's really trying to make the wealth redistribution argument. He's probably going to mention the 1950s, or the 60s, where we had, you know, huge, giant progressive tax rates. Okay.
Which meant that our parents and grandparents lived much, much better lives than people in the early 20th century did. So for now, we need to focus on getting some form of change, because if we spend all of our time arguing about the specific form of the change, we won't get anything at all. There's no point arguing about battle tactics until you have an army. So let's talk about how can we force these politicians.
Nope, that's not true. I mean, that's not a great analogy. In fact, you would want to be doing the opposite. You'd say, hey, what kind of an army do we want? Okay, well, we're going to be fighting Russia. Russia has, like, you know, these kinds of tanks, these kinds of aircraft, these kinds of these things. How do we want to fight those people? Okay, well, we can use very super specific anti-air technology that is specifically targeted at Russian computers. It's going to suck at everything else, but Russian MiGs, they're going to be annihilated by this stuff. Okay, so then we'll build that. That's building your army out. You could do it the other way, but if you're talking about the most efficient, effective way to do it, yeah, you want to think about your tactics first.
The things that we need. All right, so I, as most of you will know if you've been watching this channel, was a economist, mathematician, and a trader. I worked as a trader from 2008 to 2014. I made a lot of money by recognizing basically exactly the diagram I showed you at the beginning of the video, which was that wealth has was and still is being drained out of the middle class, out of the working class, accumulated by the very rich. That was going to suck spending power out of the economy, and that was going to impoverish most ordinary families. I bet on that, and I was very successful betting that the economy would collapse, and I made a lot of money on that. And I quit trading in 2014. I was living in Tokyo at the time, and I came back to London basically with this conviction that I was right in this relatively simple economic understanding that we would see continued further and further and further worsening of living standards. And I didn't want that to happen.
That's not the same thing. It's not the same thing to say living standards go down and inequality goes up. It's entirely possible that inequality, explodes and gets way bigger, but living standards go up. That's totally possible, and in fact, that's usually the case. The idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. Even the poorest people in a super wealth inequality, disparate nation could be living massively better lives than someone in a country where the wealth inequality divide is like super small. Like, would you rather be poor in the UK or middle class in North Korea? You're going to be probably starving to death in North Korea. If you're poor in the UK, yeah, you've probably got like a phone and you've got, a relatively, you're paying rent. You're not dying. You're not doing as well as your neighbor or, the person across the street, but you're living okay.
I don't want that to happen. I assume you don't want that to happen because it will mean poverty for you and your kids. And my plan was basically simply to come back to London and show people this truth. And I've been spending basically those nearly 11 years now since I came back trying to figure out how can we actually stop this crisis from happening. And my plan has always been, really relatively simply, this crisis will impoverish 70, 80, 90% of the population here in the UK, in the US, in Australia, in Europe, wherever you're watching. And you're seeing that happening. You are seeing larger and larger percentages of the population being impoverished. And it doesn't make sense for the public to accept that. So all we need to do is show them what's happening, make it clear to them what's happening, and they will reject it, basically. But it's been 11 years now, and we haven't achieved it yet. So I would like to explain basically how my thinking has developed and refined into trying to figure out a way that we can really effectively stop it. So when I first came back, the first place I went to was I worked for an economics think tank in London called the New Economics Foundation. I volunteered there for about 6 months. This is a progressive economics think tank in London. I kind of figured that these would be the guys who would help you sort of introduce new economics ideas into society. Their name was literally the New Economics Foundation. And I volunteered there for 6 months. I met a lot of nice people. Some of them I'm still friends with now. But I basically became convinced that they didn't really have the capacity to really push this new idea out. There was very little appetite for ideas on inequality. They needed to get funding for all of their individual projects, and they could get a lot of funding for global warming stuff and kind of identity politics stuff, but there was basically nobody funding wealth inequality stuff. The space was quite middle class, so in many cases there were people who were not themselves being directly hurt. I make the point a lot on this channel, and I think this is important to recognise. Crises of inequality, they impoverish 90% of the population, but they make like 1-2% of the population absolutely really bloody rich, and these guys, they benefit from it. And there's another sort of 3-4% below that are pretty well protected, and I sort of found in that think tank space a lot of these protected people, basically. And unfortunately, whilst they are in many cases very well meaning, I didn't see any chance of getting change essentially from that think tank space. So I went then to university. I did a 2-year economics masters at Oxford, and you could probably imagine if the think tank space was quite rich and quite upper middle class, the Oxford University was unbelievably rich and middle class. And good luck to anyone who's trying to make change in academia, and we do need people in those spaces.
Come on. academia, communist economics is like huge. I should just say, sort of Marxist theory is enormous in that. We know that.
I became pretty convinced that academia was almost completely a dead end at the moment. I think, we've made videos on this. I think the situation of university, especially elite university academic economics, is just, if the situation wasn't so serious, it would be quite funny, really. You've got a lot of very smart kids like locked in tiny windowless rooms doing unbelievably complicated mathematics with absolutely no idea what's happening in the world. So I don't think that we're going to make change from those spaces. I eventually decided to try and move into the media space. I made that space in early 2020. And the idea was basically, I've spent 5-6 years now trying to convince rich people to deal with inequality. I don't think they're going to do it. The people who are affected by and hurt by this economic crisis of inequality are ordinary families like you, ordinary families like your kids. And I was hoping that in the media space, I might be able to basically speak to the people who are being hurt, speak to people who are being affected, instead of speaking to the rich guys who are benefiting. And that is really when I started to develop.
I can see that. I mean, the other side of that is, as I've kind of said a couple of times here, taxing the rich does not put money into the hands of the middle class or the working class. It takes that money and puts it into the hands of the government. Then the government has to do something with it. The government is not going to just basically go, all right, we're giving everybody a check. All right, that might be the best way to do it. Certainly that would be my preferred way about this, is okay, if we're going to tax, wealth, we're going to say every, person who has land and property that is not working land, so not like farms or factories even necessarily, but if they've got rental properties and they've got land, that stuff specifically, the value of that is going to get taxed 2% a year, something like that. That 2% goes to the government and it is immediately dispersed amongst the population. Just everybody therefore gets a check, 2% of the land value of, property value of the richest people in the country. Okay. That would be something where I'd go, okay, I can kind of see that. Maybe that even works. It's not going to solve inequality, but at the very least, it makes, holding wealth in terms of these finite resources way less attractive. And therefore, maybe, they just distribute it out voluntarily, where they go, okay, yeah, we don't want to hold all of these properties and these types of things. We keep getting taxed on it. We would like to just basically, we're not going to have 100 rental properties. We'll just have 2 places here where we're holding wealth for our kids or something like that. That would be reasonable. Is the government going to do that? I don't think so. I don't think the government's going to do that.
The plan I've been doing the last 4 years, especially the last 2-3 years, which is, I genuinely think that the vast majority of people in this country, and I think this is true if you're here or in the States or in Europe or Australia, do not have a single person in the mainstream media who is communicating effectively, clearly, understandably what is happening in this economic crisis that is increasingly devastating living conditions for millions of ordinary families across the world. And
I think they tend to be right-wing people. They tend to be right-wing populist people. Those are the people that I actually do hear this a lot from.
I started to feel that there was a massive gap, basically, a huge gap to fill, basically telling people what is happening. And I started to feel that really strongly during COVID, that basically the quality of our economics media was extremely low. The quality of our politics from an economics perspective was extremely low.
Yeah.
And because of those failures, we were going to see a continuation of falling living standards, but we were going to see this enormous unmet demand for somebody who was simply talking about and explaining what is actually happening in the economy. Okay, so let's talk about what is happening in economics and politics. I think you basically have two strands of economic thought and two strands of political thought, which is you have this kind of old school, the kind of dominant economic ideology of the last 30, 40 years, which is really, I think, personified by the current Labour government, which is if we just do everything a little bit more efficiently, things will get better. There's no explicit focus on inequality at all. They often tend to focus on trying to change the system in such a way that
this doesn't ring true to me, but I'm not from the UK, so I don't know if this is true.
it benefits the rich, which means inequality tends to get worse over time. And living standards fall for the majority, while this kind of semi-elite group of politicians and economists themselves are protected. This is really clearly dying. You can see it in the complete collapse in support for almost all of the traditional centre-left and centre-right parties across Europe. Those parties are only really hanging on in the UK and the US under systems which basically make it almost impossible to replace them. And you're seeing even in those countries, those parties become extremely unpopular and die. That creates this massive gap for new ideas. So I think we are here in this space now. There is a massive popular demand for new ideas. And really, the political left has almost completely failed to put any new ideas on the table. And that gap is being filled by a new political right.
I don't know if I could say it's failed in putting forward new ideas, because these ideas are not new. The idea of, taxing rich people is not new. Taxing wealth, that's not new. It's just that they've never been effective. So they're not new. Maybe, I think there's a very real possibility that we are going to see a resurgence in these things in certain countries. Very possibly the UK. I don't know if we'll see it in, the US, because the dominant sort of populist new ideas from here is from the right, is looking at other causes or explanations of why there is this transfer of wealth / not even necessarily transfer of wealth, but the inability for lower class, working class, middle class people to accumulate wealth. I think there is a good argument that, a lot of this has to do with migration. There's a lot to do with, illegal immigration, people coming in, there's more people, there's the same amount of resources, and therefore all of those resources to the people that are poorer become more and more unaffordable because there's more people competing for the same amount of it. And certainly for things like housing, if you've got more people, you need more houses. If you're not making more houses, putting more people into the country makes each of those houses more and more and more and more and more valuable and therefore more expensive. If you then were to say, all right, we're going to deport 1 million people because they're here illegally, well, you've basically just made 1 million more houses.
Which I think has been very effective in doing things like utilising social media, utilising influencers, especially on the right, to basically sell a new political story. And they are, in a sense, taking advantage of the exact same thing which I've just described to you, which is that politics has failed, media has failed. There is massive demand for something which is new because people know that the status quo is failing. And these guys are filling that gap with the problem is foreigners, the problem is immigrants, and they will be very successful. They clearly have taken power of the US government. They will increasingly take control of European governments, and they have taken control of many European governments. They are successful, I think, not necessarily because they are good. I think simply because no one else has really tried to occupy that gap. I think there is massive demand for and massive potential for a simple message delivered to working people. The reason you are getting poor is because your wealth is being squeezed out by the rich and the super rich. They are taking the wealth from you. You are unable to compete with them. The working class is being bankrupted. The middle class is disappearing. Tax, wealth, not work. I honestly think we have a chance of winning power on that.
Okay, so this is the first time I've heard him say tax, wealth, not work, which apparently is his catchphrase. It's the first time I've heard him say it. It's about halfway through the video. I do, again, I mean, this is going to be something that he's going to say, I'm not interested in this, but what kind of work? Is it any kind of work? Because, I mean, let's say you're working on creating a new company and that means that you made the new Facebook. You made $1 billion. You made 10 billion. You made $100 billion. Okay, is that work? Yeah, I don't know. Because you're now super rich. You're now insanely super duper crazy rich, and the majority of your money is wealth. It's it's tied up in stock for this company. So I mean, like in my mind, yeah, you made that, you earned that, you created something of incredible value to other people. You didn't suck that out of other people. And therefore, that's yours. But you're now part of this super rich class who are all, devils. And therefore, you're now subject to all of these types of things. I do, and again, I mean, this is where I kind of do run into legitimate issues with the idea of tax the rich. It's because, they're not all the same. And if you're penalizing people because they're successful and wealthy and rich, because there's some of those people are wealthy and rich because they inherited it, because they're just, they are kind of squeezing people for it. You're then also disincentivizing the creative rich to be creative. And I feel like you're just gonna lose a lot of, value. Because I mean, all the richest people in the world made their money. They did not, they didn't inherit it. It's theirs much more intrinsically than you could say that. And again, I do think the reason why he's successful, and I'm sure most of the comments that I get are from people in the UK, and therefore the majority of his audience is from the UK, is because the European mindset is much more inundated with the idea of aristocracy. The people that are rich simply because they were born into it through no fault of their own, and they do accumulate wealth through extractive measures. We just, we don't really live in that world anymore, and we haven't for kind of a while.
And I think in this country, in the short term, our because we have this centrist party in power, our problem is how do we squeeze the centre on that? And I think the power we have is that the centre is, number one, phenomenally unpopular, and number two, will fail on the economy. So I think we really have power there. The longer term risk is not the centre, because I think the centre will progressively lose popularity, but these new right ideas.
It essentially already has. I mean, realistically, the parties that are gaining power and traction in these types of things are, the left, the right. Or in the US sense, the sort of like, it's like populist versus establishment.
The problem we have is that they will always be much, much, much better funded than us. Quite simply because once billionaires realise that the long-term battle is a battle between tax the rich and blame the foreigners, the billionaires will increasingly aggressively fund blame the foreigners as an idea.
Maybe, but then again, I mean, I think a lot of this also has to do with like blame the foreigners. Okay, well, why are they here? I think there's a legitimate argument to be made that the reason people were imported was because politicians wanted GDP growth, and importing people means the GDP line goes up, even if that means that, everybody's individual property values and, ways to accumulate wealth, their purchasing power, all of these types of things goes down because there's more people to compete for those things. Well, for the politicians, it's good. And the thing is that, GDP line goes up also means that, rich people assets go up. And therefore, if you were to say, hey, we got rid of all of these foreigners, we got rid of all these illegal immigrants, GDP line goes flat. Okay, well now rich people are, they're leveraging a lot of that money. A lot of that money is basically being invested into other things based on the idea that, there's going to be constant growth. And that means that, it's going to hit those rich people a lot harder than people that are not, highly leveraged and invested in different types of things. So, it literally might be more beneficial for them to be like, yeah, no, I'll take the taxes if you can make sure that, line goes up, because that will be better for me.
But we do also have a kind of trump card against this new right, which is when it comes to economic policy, almost all of these new right parties want to slash taxes on rich people. And I think that's partly ideological, and I think it's partly because
I think they just want to just slash taxes, period.
They're funded by billionaires, and that's what the billionaires want.
The left is funded by billionaires too. The billionaires just fund everybody because it gives them power.
Which means that even in the cases where these guys do take power, and we've seen it in some European countries, but most obviously we've seen it recently in the US, these guys will also preside over an increase in wealth inequality, which will mean, again, a squeeze of assets away from the middle class, away from the working class, and further falls in ordinary families' living conditions. So these guys, whilst they will be very well funded, and they are very clearly in the ascendancy, they have a really, really serious weakness.
Again, funding-wise, Kamala Harris raised more money than Trump by a good portion, much more quickly as well.
Which is they are literally impoverishing their own supporters. But this is not just the weakness of the political right, this is also the weakness of the political centre. I put a video out a few weeks ago saying Trump and Labour will both fail because they will both allow wealth inequality to increase, which means the squeezing out of wealth from ordinary families to the rich. And
again, I just have to reiterate, wealth inequality does not mean that the poor get poorer. They get relatively poorer, but they could get actually richer. So if your purchasing power goes up and the amount of money that you make goes up, but the richest people get even richer, yeah, that doesn't mean that the poorer people are worse off. Usually they're better off.
As much as this movement is small and it's almost completely unfunded, the power that we have is both of our competitors are actively impoverishing their voter base, aggressively impoverishing their voter base. So I think we really, really have a chance by pushing a single message again and again and again. Wealth inequality is what is making you poor. The only way to protect your families from poverty is to get the wealth back from the very rich. That means fixing a broken tax system which taxes you at higher rates than them. It means change.
You're not taxed at a higher rate. If you're living in a, liberal democracy, if you're, speaking English and watching this video, if you're in the US, the UK, you're in Australia, the richer, there's a progressive tax system. The rich people get taxed to higher rates than you. Okay, that's just a fact.
Changing the tax system to tax them more, to tax you less, tax wealth, not work. Now, I want to make it clear, because I'm in the business of predictions, what will happen if we don't get this onto the table. If we don't get this idea onto the table, then we will be left with essentially the two voices on the table that are already there, which is one, this kind of tired old centrism where we just say business, 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 growth, 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 entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship to ourselves again and again, a million times whilst we impoverish the working class. and this new right idea of the problem is immigrants, the problem is foreigners, and because you have only two basic ideas.
Okay, and here's another question. Impoverishing the working class. Is it the case that everyone in the working class wants to accumulate wealth? I don't think that's true. I think most people, just in general, are very happy to not accumulate wealth if they can live a good life. Now, maybe we're in a situation where in which you have to grab wealth, you have to hoard wealth in to basically get the possibility of, living a good life. That's possible. We might be there. Certainly seems like in the UK we're much closer to that. But I don't think the idea that impoverishing the working class is, it sounds bad to say, but it's like, is a bad thing. Like the idea of working class people cannot accumulate wealth. Okay, let's say that they can't. What if we make it so that, they can live very good, happy lives? They can raise their families. They've got, time off for leisure. They can, send them to schools that are good. They can get an education. They can do everything that they want to do, but they are not, accumulating wealth in the sense that, they're not putting stuff into savings. Like what they get in, they spend. That's also the majority of people. What you earn gets spent. That is not necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad thing. People kind of just tend to do that. It's not really me, but I do think that the idea of we want to structure society such that everyone can stack resources and wealth is probably non-human. Like it's just not, it doesn't vibe with what people actually want to do. People would rather not be deprived of stuff such that they can, stack savings.
Is on the table. What you'll have is you'll get one party in power. So, for example, in this country, we currently have the boring centrists in power. They will oversee a growth in inequality, and they'll become very unpopular, and they'll be replaced by the problem is foreigners party. And the problem is foreigners party will also watch inequality grow, and they will eventually become unpopular, and people vote the boring centrists in again. And what you will see here is the right-wing party, the problem is foreigners party, has space to move into, which is they can say, okay, the reason we failed was because we weren't hard enough on foreigners. They can rebrand and they can come in further to the right. And this is basically exactly what we saw in this country. We had David Cameron, who was this kind of essentially a boring centrist, and he was replaced briefly by Theresa May, but eventually by Boris Johnson, who was essentially a reflanking.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought David Cameron was like a little bit more left wing. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm not remembering correctly, but I believe that was the case, which is why he was like purged from the party later, because he was too left wing.
To the right of the political.
Am I right about that?
Right, which is, we don't want to. He really was a replacing of a boring centrist with the problem is foreigners. And when he lost, he was replaced by, very briefly, Liz Truss, who again was flanked further to the right. And when she immediately crashed the economy, we again got boring centrist Rishi Sunak, and he was replaced by boring centrist Keir Starmer. And what you are seeing now in this country is the growth of Nigel Farage, who is again the political right moving to the right. And you'll see the same thing in the US. So in the US you have
also Nigel Farage to the right. Certainly his more recent stuff seems like he's a little bit kind of left of center, if anything.
Donald Trump, he is the problem is foreigners politician. He will fail. He could be followed by another boring centrist, or he could be followed by another new sort of rebranding of the political right, which is what we need to do is be more extreme on the right. And billionaires will probably be funding these new right-wing parties because they see them as protecting them from taxing the rich. And what you'll see is eventually these right-wing parties will become more and more extreme, because it's the only way you can keep winning elections when you keep failing on the economy. What you are being popular for is blaming foreigners and immigrants, and if you're not succeeding on the economy, you can keep doubling down on that. You have space to the right to go into, whereas the centre kind of have nowhere to go. They'll become increasingly unpopular. So I think we have to be realistic about this. That leads you over a period of time from what may initially have been sensible seeming, the problem is foreigners politics, closer and closer and closer to real fascism. I mean, that is where it goes. And I'm not saying Farage is a fascist, I'm not saying Trump is a fascist. That is where it will go over time. This is exactly what happened in the early 20th century. That is what will happen if we do not get a new voice on the table. And I think it's worth sitting and thinking about that for a minute, because I know we live in countries, you know, here in the UK, but I know we've got a growing US viewership. We live in countries where politics is increasingly factional, and people who view themselves as on the left hate people who view themselves as on the right. People who view themselves as on the right hate people who view themselves as on the left.
Less
the way
so, but
this will go will be I was going to say slow, but it could become increasingly quick, slide into fascism, whilst both of you...
Okay, when you say fascism, I don't know, because I feel like fascism, when people say fascism, they mean like a sort of just super right-wing authoritarianism. I would just say that the slide is going to be towards authoritarianism, which is definitely what we're seeing. You know, right or left, we're moving towards government, moving more authoritarian. You know, hey, you've got to get your ID out, dox yourself to use the internet. Okay, is that right-wing authoritarian? I don't care. It's just authoritarianism.
Those of you who view yourselves as on the left and those of you who view yourselves as on the right will slide further and further and further into poverty. So I think it's really, really important that you recognise neither of these groups are going to give you what you need, which is your houses back and your ability to be able to have a family. Okay, so this is a fight which I genuinely believe we can win. Not because we are strong, not because we are well funded, but quite simply because we are competing with two political ideologies which are both bankrupting the public. Bankrupting 80, 90% of the public. And that makes them very weak to a campaign which basically simply reveals the truth of what is happening, which is the reason you are getting poor is because the rich are eating your cake, they are squeezing you out, they are taking your assets, they're driving your family into poverty. The power that we have is, really, we've got two powers. One, we are the only voice which will protect ordinary people from poverty. And two, we have strength in numbers. This is genuinely in the financial interests of the vast majority of people, both on the political left and on the political right. This works for them financially. So I genuinely believe this is a fight we can win. The problem is we're not fighting it. There's just not enough people getting this idea into the public domain. And
so then I will have to say, I don't think these people are so stupid that they don't realize this. You know, like if this is happening, I would imagine it would be a felt reality that, you know, you're getting squeezed, you're getting screwed. So then how come there's not a rise of a super progressive left wing, you know, like communist, let's call it, party? But there is the rise of a right wing populist party. Why is that the case? I would say it's because people are seeing more of a blame all foreigners, you know, stand as more reasonable because they're seeing that as a definite reality, and that correlated with their loss of status. That'd be kind of, I mean, that'd be my guess. Because, I mean, if he is correct that these things are happening, I think there would be an organic grassroots left wing, left wing populist movement that I'm just not seeing.
I want to talk a little bit about two ideas. One is the Overton window, and the other is message discipline. So the Overton window is an idea in politics, that there's a kind of window of ideas which are considered acceptable, sensible, normal, non-extreme at a given point in time. We've got some videos on this channel, maybe I'll link one in the description, talking about why economists don't talk about wealth inequality. The vast majority of economists are rich people who are not being hurt by this, they are benefiting from it, and they do not think inequality is the problem. That means that at the moment, focusing on and centralizing inequality, wealth inequality as the core problem, is not popular with economists, and it's outside the Overton window. This really is the key challenge that we have. And people sometimes ask me, why don't Labour talk to you? Why don't Labour get this idea in their manifesto? Really, it comes down to, very simply, that answer. This is outside the Overton window. The group of people in this country and in most countries across the world who decide what is acceptable, what is sensible, what is wise, is a very small group of rich and posh people. And they've decided that this idea is simply unacceptable. We need to push back on that, but in order to do that, we need message discipline. So this is the second concept I want to introduce. Message discipline is again another political idea. This is the reason why when politicians go on TV, they're always unbelievably, painfully boring, which is that they get told by their political party, if this subject comes up, you have to say this. And when they go on the TV, they're not really thinking, what's my opinion on that? What do I think about that? They're thinking, what has my political party told me to say about this issue?
True.
And for that reason, when politicians go on TV, they all say the exact same thing again and again and again and again and again. And the reason they do this is how you get an idea into the Overton window. If you say an idea again and again and again and again, and it's important that a variety of people say it, and then you guys out there hear 25 different posh-looking, smart-sounding people saying the same idea, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, on the TV, then you start to believe that idea. This is how an idea goes from being crazy, wacky, unbelievable, no way true, to being common sense. An idea travels from being absolutely outrageous to being commonly accepted as common sense simply by lots of people saying it again and again and again and again and again. Now, I'm not a political party. We don't have a political party. We will and are trying to influence the political parties. What I have is this YouTube channel and you. And we need to start using this message discipline now. I need to keep saying, and you need to keep saying, and you need to get your friends and your family to keep saying, obviously the reason why you guys are getting poor is because of growing wealth inequality. And you can choose, when you push that message, either to use my name in my videos or not. So you can go to your friends and family and say, hey, look, there's this guy, Gary's Economics. I think he's explained it really, really well. I think if you watch his videos, it's really compelling that actually the reason for growing poverty is inequality. I think it's important that to stress this, you increasingly say it's obviously true, because it is obviously true. Obviously, you cannot squeeze all of the wealth out of the middle class and not expect poverty. You cannot concentrate the wealth into an unbelievably small group of people and not expect poverty. These things are obviously true, and we need to make it understood that they're obviously true by saying them again and again and again and again. And when I say you can...
I don't know if they're obviously true. That's kind of the idea of, these debates. When he does have these debates, there is another side to it that is also very reasonable. And there are other arguments for why this is happening. Now, maybe they're just contributing factors. Maybe they are the causal factor. Maybe they are the foundational reason for why these things are happening. I also do think, again, it rankles me that the idea of, the solution to this doesn't seem to me to be workable in terms of extracting wealth from the rich via taxes that go to the government. The government is then probably not going to just give you that money back. It's it's probably not going to just, distribute that somehow. It's going to make a firm, it's going to make a program, it's going to make an initiative, and that's going to benefit who? It's going to benefit the government. So I don't think that, pulling that money out of the rich people and giving it to the government is going to eliminate poverty or wealth inequality. Otherwise, it's just going to concentrate it in, what is already an increasingly authoritarian number of regimes that are, our governments.
Use this channel or not use this channel. What I mean is, if you think it's the best way to convince someone to send them to that podcast or to send them to our Understand the Economy series, do that. But I think one weakness that we have, one weakness that I have, is that this channel is called Gary's Economics. The logo is like my face and it's become very attached to my personal brand. It's very, very important that these ideas are not 100% attached to these are Gary Stevenson's ideas, because it's easy to take out one guy, basically. I know how this is going to work. If this keeps growing at the rate that it's growing, I will get attacked more and more and more and more and more by the press, by the media, and eventually these guys will land the punch that's going to land and I will probably be gone. And I understand that's how it works. It's important that rather than just saying, go watch Gary's Economics, that you start understanding these ideas yourself and talking about them as your ideas, as ideas that are obviously true, that you understand. It's really, really important that we have a diversity of voices saying this, and that it's not just me, it's not just me.
We want a diversity of voices saying this, but we don't want any kind of diversity of thought or ideas, because it's obviously true, and everybody should be saying that it's obviously true. And therefore, if it's obviously true, if somebody says something different, they're obviously wrong. Why are they obviously wrong? Probably because they're obviously stupid.
And that brings me to another weakness that we have, which is we need broader buy-in from powerful spaces. So what I mean when I say that is, I decided very consciously to move to a YouTube channel as opposed to writing for The Guardian, for example, because
you knew YouTube was a better outlet for your opinions.
I felt that it would be meaningful to working class people to see and hear somebody from a working class background speaking about the economy. And I think that is one of the reasons why this channel has been popular. I think that's one of the reasons why the book is popular, because working class people really want to see somebody from the same place as them speaking about the economy. That makes me a powerful communicator to ordinary people, to the working class. But it really, really hurts me when I'm trying to communicate to people in positions of power.
That's entirely possible, although again, I will say this is a specific UK thing. The UK really does despise the lower classes. The US doesn't really have that as much, but whenever I hear people from the UK talk about this stuff, they are very aware that, if you've got a lower class, working class accent, you are scum and therefore need to be, shoved off out of the public eye.
So when I say that, I mean high-level politicians, or really any politicians, people in the media, high-level economists, central bankers, people in think tanks, people in the civil service. It's a relatively small group of people who control the levers of power, and almost all of them are rich, posh people that come from rich, posh schools, and they don't like me. They don't like the way that I look, they don't like the way that I sound, they don't like the way that I come out of nowhere, having made a ton of money, and say, you guys are all idiots, you guys are all wrong. And that's very understandable. That's very, very understandable. So we need, and what I need you to do, if you can, is to act as a go-between. Basically, you act on two levels, which is number one, you really make this common sense wisdom on the streets amongst ordinary British men and women, or American men and women, if that's where you are. Get everybody to understand it. But if you are able to get into positions of power, or influence people in positions of power, politicians, media, influencers, celebrities, love to get Carol Vorderman on the channel if you're interested. Civil service, academics, if you can get into these spaces or influence these spaces, especially if you sound less working class than me, I need people like you to act as go-betweens. And don't go in there and say, oh, Gary's economics is really smart and you guys are idiots. Go in there and speak in your posh voice and say, hey, I think this idea is, this poverty could be caused by inequality. We need academics saying it. We need people on the political left saying it. We need people at these think tanks saying it. We really, really, really need more diversity of voice. We are all part of this conversation. So I need you to boost the ideas, boost the videos, boost the channels, but also start trying to spread them, trying to understand them yourself. I want to see academics at Oxford or at Harvard or at Cambridge or LSE writing papers saying we think the reason for growing inequality, for growing poverty, is growing inequality. I need other people saying it, with voices like that. It can't just be me. And if we do that,
all right, so the idea that wealth disparity, wealth inequality is the root of this problem, I don't think it's a new idea. Unless I'm mistaken, this is the underpinning idea of the Communist Manifesto. Right?
I think we can win. I think we can win. You know, I've been doing this for a long time, and I never expected it to kind of grow at this unbelievable pace that it is growing. And it's quite scary for me, to be honest, to see the growth on the channel, and the book's been #1 for 6 weeks now, and I just, yeah, I get recognised all the time. It's scary and it's weird, but basically I was always convinced that a simple, true message, which could continually be reproven by predicting better than the mainstream media, predicting better than the mainstream politicians, would be believed by the public. And I think it's starting to be proven to be true. So my message to you guys is, get on board. Start singing from the same hymn sheet. Get some message discipline. If you're out there in the political left, ask your political party you're associated with, or your think tank you're in, or the groups you're associated in, why are we not talking about inequality as the cause for poverty? Why are we not saying that? If you're on the political right, if you're a member of the Conservative Party, if you're a Reform voter, ask them, why are they not saying that? You know, this is not a left-right issue. This is a poverty issue. This is going to happen in every country, and it doesn't matter who's in charge. Both Donald Trump and Labour are presiding over increasing inequality. You know, call into LBC, ask them, you know, why are you not talking about inequality? Well, inequality is blowing up. You know, stock markets are at all-time highs. The rich are richer than they've ever been, and your ordinary families can't turn the heating on. You know, make it common sense. Of course it's inequality. Of course it's inequality. Say it again and again. Share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. Share it with anyone who has any position of power. You know, call into the call-in shows. Make this the new common sense. And I guess this brings me to the final point, which is a lot of people want concrete actions. They say to me, what can I do, Gary? What can I do? You've freaked me out. You've scared me.
Right.
What can I do? And I want to finish this video by trying my best to give like a really clear answer to that question of what can you do. The first thing I want you to do is take a big breath in, and a big breath out, and recognize this economic situation is an economic situation that is going to get worse. It is an economic situation that is going to get worse. This situation...
Take a big, deep, calming breath in and freak out more because it's only going to get worse. Okay.
...of this lack of immigrants, this lack of foreigners is also a situation that is going to get worse. Both of those things are going to affect different people differently. You know, if you are not the poorest, think about how that's going to affect people poorer than you. If you are not on the sharp end of that anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner hatred, think about how it's going to affect people who are. The reason I say those things is twofold. The first one is, I need you to be ready emotionally for the difficult and divisive times that are coming. Because if you are angry, if you are frightened, if you're scared, I can't do nothing with you. I can't do nothing with you. I want to tell another quick story.
So I will have to say, I do agree. If things are bad, you need to be ready for them to get worse. The perfect example of this, from my mind, is the Javier Milei Argentina situation. Okay? Things were really bad there. Milei comes in. What happens? Does he change things right away? No. They get worse. There's real pain that is suffered. Now, according to all the metrics, everything that I've seen, things have gotten way better. But there was a period of real legitimate pain, and people were willing to suffer that pain because they had experienced the bad before, and they could see very clearly why it was the case. It was this sort of, government authoritarian redistribution of wealth that was making things bad systemically. There were a couple of nice bonuses here and there that obviously Milei does away with. So, you're not getting free electricity anymore to certain things. You have to pay for that, which is bad. That hurts. That sucks. But the country gets better. I don't know if Gary's solutions would work. My intuition is no. I think it's going to basically take, if they were to ever to be enacted, you would take money and wealth from the rich people and you're going to concentrate it in the hands of the government. Okay? The government is not really going to give that away because for the same reason that rich people would want to give that away, they're people. If you can get power and wealth and keep it, you're going to do it. And the government is, let's be totally honest here, better at keeping hold of power and resources than rich people are. If rich people can just straight up be taxed by the government, and the government, what is the recourse for the government holding that wealth and that power? Violent revolution is the only way to get them out, right? I mean, I guess you could vote them out potentially, but if you've got, a uniparty that's completely in control of everything and there's really like no divide between the two of them and they each decide on who they're going to run, who are the people that, could potentially be in the party or not, who's going to be, winning the election because we're putting money behind them and not the other person. They are way more difficult to oust, and it's going to be much more difficult to grasp that wealth and power away from them than it would be the rich. The rich people could just lose it. The rich people could just be like, oh, okay, the market went down. Oh, crap, we just lost all of our money. We have to sell it for whatever. The history of the world is littered with massively rich, titanically wealthy people losing it all in a generation because the, scion of that house was a dumbass. Okay? Yeah, do you hear about the Medicis anytime? No. Like the richest family on the planet by enormous margins. And what happened? Some guy just spent it wrong and they're gone now. Rich people can lose their money and wealth very quickly and easy. Governments? Much more difficulty.
From when I went on Piers Morgan a few weeks ago. So when I went on, Piers was running like quite late, like an hour, maybe like an hour, 20 minutes late, which meant I had to sit in the green room with Dave Rubin and his entourage for an hour and 20 minutes. They're very nice. And while we were in the green room, we could see on a big TV the interviews that Piers Morgan was doing. And I don't watch Piers Morgan's channel normally, but I watched these about an hour of interviews. I think it was 2 interviews before I went on. And I could see what they were doing, right? They have their left-wing head and they have their right-wing head. And both the interviews before mine, they had the left-wing heads were all black and the right-wing heads were all white. And they tried to say things to make that left-wing head angry, to make them lose their temper. When I was on, they wanted to get I think there was a transsexual who they're trying to get her angry about the Olympics or something, just trying to get her to say something outrageous, tried to get her to lose her temper. Then they look to the audience and say, look, this is what those people are like. And what they're trying to do is cause division. They're trying to cause division, they're trying to make you hate each other, they're trying to make you angry, they're trying to make you think those guys out there are your enemy. And when I say that, I'm not just talking to the political right, I'm talking to the political left as well. They want you to hate each other, they want you to be angry. Listen, here in the UK, in the US, all over the world, the working class is multiracial, it's multi-ethnic, it includes men and women, it includes people who own houses, people who don't own houses. If you hate each other, if the men hate the women and the women hate the men and the white people hate the non-white people and the non-white people hate the white people, I can't do nothing with you. We will never be able to stand together, we will never be able to fight, we will never be able to win. The power that we have is that there's more of us. That is a power we only use if we fight together. We cannot afford to allow ourselves to be frightened, to be scared, or to hate each other. The second thing is, I need you guys to be prepared for a long fight. We don't win this tomorrow, we don't win it the next day, we don't win this next week, we don't win this next year, okay? Your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents fought for generations for the kind of ability you have to own assets and that your parents had to own assets. This is not a fight we win quickly. The reason that I say that is that I know people want me to arrange some kind of march on Parliament. Now, we talk about this a lot. I don't want to get you guys to go crazy, email your MP every day, march on Parliament, use all your energy, and then be in a situation where we're not in a position to get anything. I don't want you guys to be disappointed. This is a long fight. You need to conserve your energy for a marathon, not a sprint, okay? We build, we build, we build, we build, we build, we build, and then we go together and we win when we have enough power. We can win the argument. We are fighting against two political ideologies which will definitely drive your family and your kids' families into poverty. They've got nothing to offer you. The argument is there, the argument is simple. We need to get wealth back into the hands of ordinary families. That means taxing working people less and rich people more. Tax wealth, not work. Protect ordinary families. Make it common sense. Tell your friends, tell your families, build the movement. Support other people who are saying the same things. Be that person yourself.
All right. I think we got it, but let's finish it up.
We need more voices singing off the same hymn sheet. We can win this argument. You win the argument, you get the power, you change the tax system, and then you get your assets back. And that is how we stop the economy from collapsing. Good luck, thank you. Send it to your mum. Send it to your friends, to your family. Good luck.
Did I come away from that video with a better understanding of his policy positions? Yes, I think I did. Is it a little bit more reasonable than I thought? I gotta be honest, I kind of am coming around to the idea that I get it. I understand why he's an attractive figure to people. I really do, I get it. I can't say I agree, mainly for the reason that I've hopefully reiterated a couple times here, which is extracting money from the rich and the wealthy via taxes increases that amount of money into the hands of the government. The government is not necessarily very good at then redistributing that to the working class or the middle class. And for the same reason that rich people want to hold on to wealth and power, the government wants to hold on to wealth and power. And the government's pretty good at doing that. They're also pretty bad at making other people's lives better. Now, that's obviously an arguable point, and I would love to hear your, comments on that down in the comments section. But I mean, I don't know. I'm like, I kind of like the guy, but I can't say that I agree with him. I really don't think so. I've got a little bit of a sense that the main reason he's doing this is for power, is for influence and fame. There's nothing totally wrong with that, but I'm trying to be a little bit more generous and charitable and think, no, that's not the case. He's doing it for a good cause, and it's not purely self-interest. With all that being said, thank you very much for your time and attention. Good luck in all your endeavors. I'll say farewell for now.